Good evening and welcome back to the channel. Today marks our second episode. What you're about to hear is drawn directly from the official history of the United States Marine Corps in Vietnam. A 9-volume series researched and written by the Marine Corps History and Museums Division and published by the U.S. government. These aren't dramatizations or second-hand accounts. This is the Corps' own record of what happened, compiled from command diaries, after-action reports, oral histories, and the accounts of the men who were there. We'll be focusing on the years when Marine involvement was most intense, the advisory era of the early 1960s, the landing at Da Nang in 1965, the brutal fighting of 1966 and 1967, and the defining crucible of 1968. We'll follow Marines from the rice paddies of the Mekong Delta to the hills above Khe Sanh. Where possible, we will go into detail on specific actions and include additional references for you to dive deeper into this history. As always, if this content is to your liking, please ensure that you like and subscribe. The language is formal, the record is honest, and the story is remarkable. Let's begin. Part 2. World War's End and Nationalist Rumblings in French Indochina. At Ho's direction, the Viet Minh promptly shifted from their anti-Japanese posture and prepared to contest the French return. Confronted with this situation in northern Indochina, the French were forced to bargain with the Communists. A preliminary agreement was reached on 6 March 1946, whereby the French agreed to recognize the newly founded but relatively weak Democratic Republic of Vietnam as a free state within the French Union. In return, Ho's government declared itself ready to welcome in friendly fashion the French army, when, in conformance with international agreement, it would relieve the Chinese forces, which had accepted the Japanese surrender in Tonkin. Shortly after the conclusion of this agreement, French forces began reoccupying Tonkin and northern Annam. Within 6 months, they controlled every major strategic position from the Chinese border to the Ca-Mau Peninsula, Cochinchina's southern tip. The uneasy peace was broken in December 1946 after Viet Minh and French negotiators failed to reach a final agreement on actual political control of Tonkin and Annam. When open warfare erupted, Ho withdrew the bulk of his military forces into mountainous sanctuaries along the Chinese border, but left small groups of guerrillas scattered throughout the heavily populated Red River Delta. Reinforced with contingents from Europe and Africa, the French Expeditionary Corps initially managed to hold its own and in some cases even extend its control. But drawing strength from its natural appeal to Vietnamese nationalism, the communist movement began gaining momentum in the late 1940s. Gradually, the war intensified and spread into central Annam and Cochinchina. In January 1950, the French moved to undercut the Viet Minh's appeal to non-communist nationalists by granting nominal independence to its Indochina possessions. Under the terms of a formal treaty, all of Vietnam, Tonkin, Annam, and Cochinchina, was brought together under a Saigon-based government headed by Emperor Bao Dai. Laos and Cambodia likewise formed their own governments, whereupon all 3 countries became known as the Associated States of Indochina. This new arrangement, however, had little effect on the ongoing war with the Viet Minh. In accordance with the treaties, the Associated States became members of the French Union and agreed to prosecute the war under French direction. Moreover, French political dominance in the region continued, virtually undiluted by the existence of the Associated States. In related developments, Mao's Chinese Communist armies seized control of mainland China in 1949, and Communist North Korean forces invaded the pro-Western Republic of Korea in 1950. These events added new meaning to the French struggle in Indochina as American policymakers came to view the war on the Southeast Asian mainland within the context of a larger design to bring Asia entirely under communist domination. Following the invasion of South Korea, President Truman immediately announced his intention to step up U.S. military aid to the French in Indochina. Congress responded quickly by adding $4 billion to existing military assistance funds. Of this, $303 million was earmarked for Korea, the Philippines, and the general area of China. The following year would see $500 million US allocated to support French operations in Indochina. By 1954, that figure would climb to an even $1 billion. Thus, the Truman administration, now confronted by the possibility that communism might engulf all of mainland Asia, extended its containment policy to Indochina. Even with rapidly increasing amounts of U.S. material assistance, the French proved unable to wrest the initiative from Giap's growing armies. Although national armies drawn from Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam were now fighting alongside the French, the Expeditionary Corps was overextended. Moreover, the French cause was extremely vulnerable to communist propaganda. On the home front, public support for the so-called Sale Guerre, Dirty War, eroded steadily during the early 1950s as the Expeditionary Corps' failures and casualties mounted. Finally, on 7 May 1954, the besieged 13,000-man French garrison at Dien Bien Phu surrendered to the Viet Minh, thus shattering what remained of French determination to prosecute the war in Indochina. In Geneva, where communist and free world diplomats had gathered to consider a formal peace in Korea, along with the Indochina problem, French and Viet Minh representatives signed a ceasefire agreement on 20 July, which ended the 8-year conflict. The bilateral ceasefire agreement substantially altered the map of the Indochinese peninsula. France agreed to relinquish political control throughout the area. Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam all gained full independence. The most controversial provision of the 20 July Agreement divided Vietnam at the Ben Hai River and superimposed a demilitarized zone over the partition line. This division, intended to facilitate the disengagement of the opposing forces, was to be temporary pending a reunification election scheduled for mid-1956. In accordance with the agreement, France immediately turned over political control of the northern zone, Tonkin and the northern half of Annam, to the communist Viet Minh. Ho promptly reestablished the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, DRV, with its capital in Hanoi. Other provisions of the Geneva Agreement called for the opposing armies to regroup in their respective zones within 300 days. Following their regroupment, the French military forces were to be completely withdrawn from the north within 300 days and from the south by mid-1956. Civilians living both north and south of the partition line were to be allowed to emigrate to the opposite zone in accordance with their political convictions. It was anticipated that thousands of Catholics living in Tonkin would seek refuge in the non-communist South. Other articles of the agreement dealt with the creation and responsibilities of an International Control Commission, ICC, to supervise the ceasefire. Canadian, Indian, and Polish delegations were to comprise this commission. On 21 July, the day following the bilateral agreement, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, Cambodia, and Laos joined France and the Viet Minh in endorsing a final declaration, which sanctioned the previously reached ceasefire agreement. The United States refused to endorse this declaration, but issued a statement to the effect that it would not use force to disturb the ceasefire. Post-Geneva, South Vietnam. The execution of the Geneva Agreement thrust that area of Vietnam south of the partition line into a period of profound confusion and instability. Even worse, the colonial period had done little to prepare the Cochin Chinese and Annamese for the tremendous problems at hand. No real apparatus for central government existed. Likewise, the long colonial period left the area with few experienced political leaders capable of establishing and managing the required governmental machinery. Political control passed nominally to the French-sponsored emperor, Bao Dai, who was living in France at the time. For all practical purposes, leadership in the South devolved upon Bao Dai's recently appointed pro-Western premier, Ngo Diem. The product of a prosperous and well-educated Catholic family from Hue, Diem had served the French briefly as a province chief prior to World War II. Always a strong nationalist, but staunchly anti-communist, he had been unable to reconcile his anti-French attitudes with the Viet Minh movement during the Indochina War. As a result, Diem had left his homeland in the early 1950s to live at a Catholic seminary in the United States. There he remained until his appointment as premier in mid-June of 1954. The months immediately following the Geneva Agreement found Ngo Diem struggling to create the necessary governmental machinery in Saigon, the capital of the Southern Zone. At best, however, his hold on the feeble institutions was tenuous. A serious confrontation was developing between the premier and the absent Bao Dai, still residing in France. Further complicating the political scene was the presence of Hua Hao and Cao Dai armies in the provinces surrounding the capital, and the existence in Saigon of an underworld organization named the Binh Xuyen. Founded just after World War I, the Cao Dai claims more than 1.5 million faithful in South Vietnam. The religion incorporates elements of Taoism, Buddhism, Christianity, Confucianism, and large doses of spiritualism. Its clergy, headed by a pope, is organized in a hierarchy modeled on that of the Roman Catholic Church. The extent of its borrowing is suggested by the fact that adherents count the French author Victor Hugo as one of their saints. Politically, the Cao Dai moved sharply in the direction of nationalism during the 1940s, organized its own army, and fought sporadic actions against the French and the subsequent French-controlled government of Emperor Bao Dai until suppressed by the Diem government in 1954. Like the Cao Dai, the Hua Hao is peculiarly Vietnamese. In the late 1930s, a Buddhist monk named Huyen Pho So began a Protestant movement within the worldly, easygoing Buddhist faith then prevalent. His followers, whose ranks grew rapidly, called themselves Hua Hao, after the village where Pho So began his crusade. Like the Cao Dai faithful and Catholics, they tended to live apart in their own villages and hamlets concentrated in the very south and west of Vietnam, primarily along the Cambodian border. Intensely nationalistic and xenophobic, they were under constant attack from the French, Japanese, and Viet Minh, and by the late 1940s had recruited a large militia which was subsequently disbanded. Today their total membership stands at about 1 million. The Binh Xuyen originally operated from the swamps south of the Chinese-dominated Chalon district of Saigon. Controlling the vice and crime of the city, by 1954 they had gained control of the police under circumstances that reeked of bribery. A year later, the organization was brutally crushed by Ngo Diem. As 1955 opened, the leaders of these three politically oriented factions were pressing demands for concessions from the new central government. Among these were permission to maintain their private armies and the authority to exercise political control over large, heavily populated areas. The outcome of the embryonic power struggle in Saigon hinged largely on control of the Vietnamese National Army, VNA. Although not considered an efficient military organization by even the most liberal estimates, the 210,000-man National Army was the principal source of organized power available to the quarreling leaders of southern Vietnam. Originally created by the French in 1950 to supplement their Expeditionary Corps, The Vietnamese National Army had since suffered from structural deficiencies. It actually had no organizational echelon between the French-controlled General Staff and the 160 separate battalions. Tied to no regiments or divisions, the Vietnamese battalions naturally were dependent on the French Expeditionary Corps for operational instructions and logistical support. Editor's footnote. Selected V&A battalions were sometimes task-organized into troops mobiles, mobile groups, by the French for specific offensive operations. But these groups, which were roughly equivalent to a regimental combat team, were never composed entirely of V&A battalions under a Vietnamese command group. A dearth of qualified Vietnamese officers and a degree of inattention on the part of the French compounded the problems which stemmed from the Army's structural flaw. Partially as a result of these shortcomings, the morale of the V&A had deteriorated sharply in the waning stages of the French Indochina War. At the time of the ceasefire agreement, high desertion rates were reported in almost every Vietnamese battalion. Still, it was evident that he who controlled the National Army would most likely control the government in the area south of the partition line. The danger that the pro-Western zone might become the victim of a sudden communist attack from the north, as had been the case on the Korean Peninsula, injected another element of uncertainty into the overall situation in southern Vietnam. The conditions which settled over the area in the immediate aftermath of the Geneva settlement suggested this possibility, since they were alarmingly similar to the conditions which had prevailed in Korea prior to the North Korean invasion of 1950. Like Korea, Vietnam was divided both geographically and ideologically. The North clearly within the orbit of the Soviet Union and Communist China, and the South under the influence of the Western powers. As in Korea in 1950, there also existed a very real armed threat to the weaker, pro-Western southern state. Immediately after the Geneva ceasefire, the Viet Minh Army regrouped north of the 17th parallel and was redesignated the People's Army of Vietnam, PAVN. American intelligence reported that the PAVN, which numbered roughly 240,000 disciplined veterans, was being reorganized and re-equipped with Soviet and Chinese weapons in violation of the Geneva Agreement. At the same time, Western intelligence sources estimated that the Viet Minh had intentionally left between 5,000 and 10,000 men south of the partition line following their withdrawal. Also done in violation of the ceasefire agreement, this meant that communist guerrillas could be expected to surface throughout the South in the event of an outright invasion. A related condition heightened fears that a Korea-type invasion might occur in Vietnam. In South Korea, a military vacuum had been allowed to form in 1949 when American units withdrew from the area. Apparently that vacuum, coupled with a statement by the American Secretary of State to the effect that the U.S. defensive perimeter in the Pacific did not include South Korea, had encouraged communist aggression. Now, with the scheduled evacuation of French armies from Indochina by mid-1956, there emerged the distinct possibility that such a military vacuum would recur, this time in southern Vietnam. Vietnam, warned one American scholar familiar with the region, may very soon become either a dam against aggression from the north or a bridge serving the communist bloc to transform the countries of the Indochinese Peninsula into satellites of China. The American response. It was in the face of this uncertain situation on the Southeast Asian mainland that the Eisenhower administration moved to discourage renewed communist military activity. First, the United States sought to create a regional international organization to promote collective military action under the threat of aggression. This was obtained on 8 September 1954 when 8 nations, the United States, Great Britain, France, New Zealand, Australia, the Philippines, Pakistan, and Thailand, signed the Manila Pact. The treaty area encompassed by the pact included Southeast Asia, the Southwest Pacific below 21 degrees 31 feet north latitude, and Pakistan. 2 weeks later, the pact was transformed into the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, SEATO. In a separate protocol, the member nations agreed that Cambodia, Laos, and the Free Territory under the jurisdiction of the State of Vietnam all resided within their defense sphere. When the Geneva ceasefire went into effect in the late summer of 1954, the machinery for implementing the military phase of the American Assistance Program for South Vietnam already existed. President Truman had ordered the establishment of a U.S. Military Assistance Advisory Group, USMAG, or MAG, in French Indochina in mid-1950, as one of several reactions to the North Korean invasion of the Republic of Korea. Established to provide materiel support to the French Expeditionary Corps, the MAG constituted little more than a logistical funnel through which U.S. military aid had been poured. Lieutenant General John M. Iron Mike O'Daniel, U.S. Army, had been assigned to command the MAG in the spring of 1954. O'Daniel's selection for the Saigon post anticipated a more active U.S. role in training of the Vietnamese National Army. He had been chosen for the assignment largely on the basis of his successful role in creating and supervising the training programs which had transformed the South Korean Army into an effective fighting force during the Korean War. Now, in the aftermath of the Geneva settlement, he and his 342-man group began preparing for the immense task of rebuilding South Vietnam's armed forces. The entire American project to assist the South Vietnamese in the construction of a viable state was delayed during the fall of 1954, while the necessary diplomatic agreements were negotiated among American, French, and South Vietnamese officials. President Eisenhower dispatched General J. Lawton Collins, U.S. Army, retired, to Saigon in November to complete the details of the triangular. Collins carried with him the broad powers which would be required to expedite the negotiations. By mid-January 1955, the President's special envoy had paved the way for the transfer of responsibility for training, equipping, and advising the Vietnamese National Army from the French to the USMAG. He and General Paul Ely, the officer appointed by the Paris government to oversee the French withdrawal from Indochina, had initialed a Minute of Understanding. In accordance with this document, the United States agreed to provide financial assistance to the French military in Vietnam in exchange for two important concessions. First, the French pledged to conduct a gradual military withdrawal from South Vietnam in order to prevent the development of a military vacuum which might precipitate a North Vietnamese invasion. Secondly, they accepted an American plan to assist in a transition stage during which the responsibility for rebuilding the Vietnamese military could be transferred to the MAG in an orderly fashion. General Collins, in addition to engineering the understanding with General Ely, had advised Premier Diem to reduce his 210,000-man military and naval forces to a level of 100,000, a figure which the U.S. State Department felt the United States could realistically support and train. The American plan to begin assisting South Vietnam encountered further delay even after the Ely-Collins understanding had been reached. Ely's government, arguing that the United States had agreed to provide only 1/3 of the amount France had requested to finance its Indochina forces, refused to ratify the agreement. The deadlock was finally resolved on 11 February 1955, when French officials accepted the terms of the Ely-Collins arrangement in a revised form. A combined Franco-American training command, designated the Training Relations Instruction Mission, TRIM, became operational in Saigon the day following the French ratification of the Ely-Collins Agreement. Headed by Lieutenant General O'Daniel, but under the overall authority of General Ely, TRIM was structured to prevent domination by either French or Americans. The training mission was composed of 4 divisions: Army, Navy, Air Force, and National Security, each of which was headed alternately by either an American or a French officer. The chief of each division had as his deputy an officer of the opposite nationality. U.S. officers, however, headed the divisions considered by MAG officials as the most important: Army and National Security. Operating through TRIM and assisted by the French military, the U.S. MAG was tasked with implementing the U.S. Military Assistance Program in a manner that would help shape the Vietnamese national forces into a cohesive defense establishment prior to the withdrawal of French forces. Only one U.S. Marine was serving with the U.S. MAG in Saigon when TRIM became operational: Lieutenant Colonel Victor J. Croizet. Croizet's assignment to the U.S. Advisory Group had resulted when General Lemuel C. Shepard, Jr., Commandant of the Marine Corps, nominated him to fill a newly created billet as liaison officer between the MAG and the French High Command during the latter stages of the Indochina War. Largely because of his French language fluency and his former association with many French officers while attending their war college in 1949, Croizet was chosen for the assignment. Lieutenant Colonel Croizet, however, did not arrive in Vietnam until 2 August 1954. By then, the ceasefire agreement had been signed at Geneva, and the need for a liaison officer with the French High Command no longer existed. General O'Daniel, therefore, assigned the newly arrived Marine officer to serve on the General Commission for Refugees, which had been created by the South Vietnamese government immediately after the ceasefire. In this capacity, Croizet became directly involved in the construction of refugee reception centers and the selection and development of resettlement areas in the South. When U.S. naval forces began assisting in the evacuation of North Vietnam, Lieutenant Colonel Croizet was sent to Haiphong, the principal seaport of Tonkin. There he headed the MAG detachment and was responsible for coordinating U.S. operations in the area with those of the French and Vietnamese. When the so-called Passage to Freedom concluded in May 1955, 807,000 people, 469,000 tons of equipment and supplies, and 23,000 vehicles had been evacuated from Communist North Vietnam. It was not until February 1955 that the Marine returned to Saigon. During Lieutenant Colonel Croizet's absence, Premier Diem had acted on a long-standing proposal to create a small Vietnamese Marine Corps. The issue of a separate Marine force composed of Vietnamese national troops had surfaced frequently since the birth of the Vietnamese Navy in the early 1950s. Although the proposal had been heartily endorsed by a number of senior French Navy officers, the downward spiral of the French war effort had intervened to prevent the subject from being advanced beyond a conceptual stage. Largely as a result of earlier discussions with Croizet, Premier Diem acted on the matter on 13 October when he signed a decree which included the following articles. Article 1. Effective 1 October 1954, there is created within the naval establishment a corps of infantry specializing in the surveillance of waterways and amphibious operations on the coast and rivers, to be designated as the Marine Corps. Article 3. The Marine Corps shall consist of various type units suited to their functions and either already existing in the Army or naval forces, or to be created in accordance with the development plan for the armed forces. In accordance with this decree, a miscellaneous collection of commando-type units was transferred from the Vietnamese National Army and Navy to the Marine Corps. Except for a naval commando unit, which had conducted amphibious raids along the coastal plains, These forces had operated in the Red River Delta with the French and Vietnamese Navy DINASOTs, River Assault Divisions. First employed in 1946, the DINASOTs had evolved into relatively effective naval commands capable of landing light infantry companies along Indochina's. Such operations had been particularly successful in the sprawling Red River Delta of Tonkin, where navigable estuaries in Viet Mirth abounded. Later in the war, as the concept was refined, the French created a number of Vietnamese National Army commando units for specific service with the DINASOTs. Still attached to the Navy commands, these units were sometimes responsible for security around the DINASOT bases when not involved in pre-planned operations. A number of these rather elite Vietnamese units, variously designated light support companies, riverboat companies, and commandos, were now transferred to the newly decreed Vietnamese Marine Corps, VNMC. By the time Lieutenant Colonel Croizat returned to Saigon in early 1955, these units, which totaled approximately 2,400 officers and men, had been evacuated from North Vietnam. Several of the commandos had been assembled at Nha Trang on South Vietnam's central coast, where the French still maintained an extensive naval training facility. There, under the supervision of a junior French commando officer, several former commandos had been organized into the 1st Marine Landing Battalion, or 1st Landing Battalion. The balance of the newly designated Marine units, however, were scattered in small, widely separated garrisons from Hue to the Mekong Delta. These units included 6 riverboat companies, 5 combat support light companies, and a small training flotilla. Diem had appointed a former Vietnamese National Army officer, Major Le Quang Trong, as senior Marine officer. But because no formal headquarters had been created, and because no real command structure existed, Major Trong remained relatively isolated from his far-flung Marine infantry units. Upon returning to Saigon, Croizat was assigned to the MAG's Naval Section and subsequently to Trim's Naval Division as the senior U.S. advisor to the newly created Vietnamese Marine Corps. In this capacity, the Marine officer quickly determined that the small Vietnamese amphibious force was faced with several serious problems. First, and perhaps its most critical, was that despite Premier Diem's decree, the Marine Corps continued to exist essentially on an informal basis. The Marine Corps itself had no real identity, its U.S. advisor later explained. It was a scattering of dissimilar units extending from Hue to the Mekong Delta area. Second, the fact that its widespread units were still dependent on the French Expeditionary Corps for logistical support underscored the weakness inherent in the VNMC's initial status. Other problems arose from the continuation of French officers in command billets throughout the Vietnamese naval forces. Under the Franco-American agreement which had created TRIM, a French Navy captain doubled as chief of the Combined Training Missions Naval Division and as commanding officer of the Vietnamese naval forces. This placed the French in a position to review any proposals advanced by the U.S. Marine advisor. Complicating the situation even further, a French Army captain, Jean-Louis Delayen, actually commanded the 1st Landing Battalion at Nha Trang. Demobilization presented another potential difficulty for the Vietnamese Marine Corps in early 1955. Under the U.S.-Vietnamese force-level agreements, the Vietnamese naval forces were limited to 3,000 men. The Marine Corps, which alone totaled a disproportionate 2,400 men, had been instructed to reduce its strength to 1,137 men and officers. With no effective centralized command structure and so many widely separated units, even the relatively simple task of mustering out troops assumed the dimensions of a complex administrative undertaking. In short, the very existence of the Vietnamese Marine Corps was threatened in a number of interrelated situations. The continuation of a separate and distinct Marine Corps hinged ultimately, of course, on the overall reorganization of the Vietnamese armed forces and their support structure. Essentially, it would be necessary to establish a requirement for such an organization within South Vietnam's future military-naval structure. Crozat personally sensed that this would be the pivotal issue in determining the VNMC's future. There were numerous representatives of the three military services from each of the three countries concerned with the fate of the Vietnamese Army, Navy, and Air Force, he pointed out. But there was no champion from within the Vietnamese Marine Corps since no corps existed except on paper. Thus, it was left initially to a French captain, a Vietnamese major, and a U.S. Marine lieutenant colonel to keep alive the idea that South Vietnam's defense establishment needed a separate Marine Corps. Political stabilization and its effects. During early 1955, the entire South Vietnamese government was engulfed by a crisis which threatened to disrupt the American plans to help build a viable anti-communist country. The crisis occurred not in the form of an overt North Vietnamese attack, but rather as a result of the South's political instability. In February, the leaders of the Hoa Hao, the Cao Dai, and the Binh Xuyen, dissatisfied with Premier Diem's refusal to accede to their various demands, formed the United Front of National Forces. By mid-March, the disaffected leaders of these organizations felt strong enough to test the Premier's strength. Trouble began late that month when the Hoa Hao began undertaking guerrilla-type activities against Diem's National Army units in the Sec's stronghold southwest of Saigon. On 28 March, Diem ordered a company of paratroops to seize the Saigon Central Police Headquarters, which the French had allowed the Binh Xuyen to control. Fighting erupted throughout the capital the next day as Binh Xuyen units clashed with loyal government forces. A truce was arranged finally in the city on 31st March after 3 days of intermittent but fierce fighting. That same day, the Cao Dai broke with the United Front and accepted a government offer to integrate some of its troops into the National Army. An uneasy peace prevailed over South Vietnam until 28 April, when new fighting broke out. By the middle of May, government forces had driven the Binh Xuyen forces from Saigon, fracturing their organization. Remnants of the bandit group, however, escaped into the extensive Rung Sat swamps south of the capital, where they continued fighting individually and in small groups. In the countryside south of Saigon, 30 of Diem's battalions, including the 1st Landing Battalion, took the offensive against the Hoa Hao regular and guerrilla forces. The national crisis, for all practical purposes, ended in the last week of June when a Hoa Hao leader surrendered 8,000 regulars and ordered his followers to cease all anti-government activities. Sporadic fighting continued, however, as Diem's forces sought to mop up Hoa Hao splinter groups fighting in the western Mekong Delta and Binh Xuyen elements still resisting in the rugged mangrove swamps south of the capital. In August, the Marine Landing Battalion fought a decisive action against the remaining Hoa Han in Kin Giang Province, about 120 miles southwest of Saigon, destroying the rebel headquarters. Later in the year, the 1st Landing Battalion, joined by several riverboat companies, reduced one of the last pockets of Binh Xuyen resistance in the Rung Sat. As a result of these and similar actions being fought simultaneously by loyal army units, organized resistance to Premier Diem gradually collapsed. The sect crisis of 1955 proved to be the turning point in Diem's political fortunes. At the height of the crisis, Emperor Bao Dai attempted to remove Diem as premier by ordering him to France for consultations. Electing to remain in Saigon and direct his government efforts to quell the rebellion, the premier declined Bao Dai's summons. The Vietnamese military forces proved loyal to the premier, having faithfully executed Diem's commands throughout the emergency. Having successfully met the armed challenge of the sects and the Bin Zuyen, and having openly repudiated Bao Dai's authority, Premier Diem had imposed at least a measure of political stability on South Vietnam. An epilogue to the sect crisis was written on 23 October when a nationwide referendum was held in South Vietnam to settle the issue of national leadership. In the balloting, since criticized as having been rigged, Premier Diem received 98.2% of the total vote against Bao Dai. 3 days later, on 26 October, South Vietnam's new president proclaimed the Republic of Vietnam, RVN. The Vietnamese Marine Corps benefited greatly from Premier Diem's successful confrontation with his political rivals. On 1 May, in preparation for the 1st Landing Battalion's deployment to combat, Major Trong had established a small Marine Corps headquarters in Saigon. Shortly thereafter, Diem had appointed a Vietnamese officer, Captain Bu Pho Chi, to replace Captain Delayan as commander of the landing battalion. The French commando officer, who was a member of TRIM, remained at Nha Trang as an advisor to the VNMC. Then, on the last day of June, Diem removed the remaining French officers from command positions throughout South Vietnam's naval forces. The combined effect of these actions was to reduce French influence throughout the nation's naval establishment, while making the Vietnamese Marine Corps more responsive to the central government. The burdens of demobilization also were lightened somewhat as a result of the sect crisis when a new force level was approved by the United States in midsummer of 1955. The new agreement, dictated in part by the requirement to integrate portions of the sect's armies into the national forces, raised the force level to 150,000 men and placed the personnel ceiling of the Vietnamese naval forces at 4,000 men. This revision enhanced the prospects for a corresponding increase in the authorized strength of the VNMC. The 1st Landing Battalion's performance against the sect forces in the Mekong Delta and the Rung Sat, moreover, tempered much of the previous opposition to a separate VMC. Heretofore, U.S. and Vietnamese Army officers had opposed the existence of a Vietnamese amphibious force apart from the National Army. Until the sect uprising, Lieutenant Colonel Crozat had used the influence afforded by his position as naval advisor to the General Staff to advocate the continuation of the VNMC. But during the sect battles, the Vietnamese Marines had firmly established their value to the new government. By displaying loyalty, discipline, and efficiency in combat, they had spoken out in their own behalf at a critical juncture in their Corps existence. Shortly before the 1st Landing Battalion deployed to fight the rebellious sect forces, 2 additional U.S. Marine advisors, an officer and a non-commissioned officer, arrived in South Vietnam for duty with the MAG. Both Marines were assigned to TRIM. Crozat dispatched the officer, Captain James T. Breckinridge, to Nha Trang, where he soon replaced Captain Delayan as advisor to the 1st Landing Battalion. As State Department policy prohibited U.S. military personnel from participating in combat activities with indigenous forces, Breckinridge was forced to await the battalion's return from the field. During its absence, he divided his time between Nha Trang and Saigon, where he assisted Colonel Crozat with planning and logistics matters. The non-commissioned officer, Technical Sergeant Jackson E. Tracy, initially remained in Saigon but later moved to Nha Trang. There, serving principally as a small unit tactics instructor to the Vietnamese Marines, Tracy impressed Breckinridge as a first-rate Marine NCO, one who could carry out the most complex assignment with little or no supervision. Soon after 1956 opened, President Diem appointed a new officer to head the Vietnamese Marine Corps. On 18 January, Major Phan Van Loo assumed command of the VNMC and thereby became the 2nd senior Marine officer. Reorganization and progress. The 1st Landing Battalion remained in action against the Bin Suyen remnants until February 1956. During this period, Lieutenant Colonel Crozat reviewed the entire organizational structure of the Vietnamese Marine Corps. By now, the size of the service had been reduced to roughly 1,800 officers and men, although it retained its original organization of 6 riverboat companies, 5 light support companies, a landing battalion, a training flotilla, and a small headquarters. This organization, with so many dissimilar units existing on one echelon, influenced Crozat to suggest that Major Liu restructure the service. Assisted by Crozat, Captain Breckenridge, and Technical Sergeant Tracy, Liu and his small staff spent several months developing and refining plans for the comprehensive reorganization of the Marine Corps. Liu submitted this package to the Vietnamese Joint General Staff, JGS. The salient feature of the plan was to create an additional landing battalion without increasing the 1,837-man ceiling, which then governed the size of the VNMC. Significantly, the plan contained a clause proposing that the Vietnamese Marine Corps be expanded to regimental size in the future. The Vietnamese Joint General Staff approved the new structure, and reorganization of the VNMC was begun when the 1st Landing Battalion finally returned to Nha Trang in February. The old riverboat and light support companies were disbanded, and 3 new units, a 4.2-inch mortar company, a headquarters and service company, and a new landing battalion were formed. Designated the 2nd Landing Battalion, this new unit formed about 25 miles south of Nha Trang at Cam Ranh Bay, where the French had trained amphibious forces during the latter stages of the Indochina War. As a result of the 1956 reorganization effort, the tables of organization and tables of equipment for the Vietnamese Marine battalions were completely revised. 3 infantry companies, a heavy weapons company, and a headquarters and service company now comprised a landing battalion. Each infantry company was organized into 3 rifle platoons and a weapons platoon. In turn, the rifle platoons each consisted of 3 10-man squads, 3 3-man fire teams, and a squad leader. The individual Vietnamese Marine rifleman was armed with the .30 caliber M1 carbine, a weapon formerly carried by many French and Vietnamese commandos. It had been retained for use within the VNMC because it was substantially shorter and lighter than the standard U.S. infantry weapon, the M1 rifle, and was therefore better suited to the small Vietnamese fighting man. The automatic rifleman in each Vietnamese Marine fire team carried the Browning automatic rifle, BAR, a heavier .30 caliber automatic weapon. The weapons platoon of the rifle company was built around 6 .30 caliber light machine guns. Within the heavy weapons company of the landing battalions was a mortar platoon, equipped with 4 81mm mortars and a recoilless rifle platoon. While this reorganization was underway, Lieutenant Colonel Crozat initiated a search for acceptable means of expanding the Vietnamese Marine Corps to regimental size. A staff study produced by the senior Marine advisor a month before the first phase of the reorganization effort had begun included several important recommendations. Crozat proposed to General O'Daniel that authorization be granted to raise the ceiling on the VNMC from 1,837 to 2,435 officers and men. This, the Marine advisor pointed out, could be accomplished without affecting the overall ceiling on all South Vietnamese military and naval forces. By reassigning to the Vietnamese Marine Corps an amphibious battalion still organized within the National Army, the 150,000-man force level would not be altered. This would transform the Vietnamese Marine Corps into a 3-battalion regiment and would unify all South Vietnamese amphibious forces under a single command. Crozat's study further recommended that the Vietnamese Marine Corps be designated part of the General Reserve of the nation's armed forces and that it be controlled directly by the Vietnamese Joint General Staff. Although no immediate action was taken on these recommendations, they were to serve as a blueprint for the future expansion of the VNMC. Equally important, they bore the seed that would eventually make the Vietnamese Marine Corps a fully integrated component of South Vietnam's defense establishment. During the ensuing 3 years, several apparently unrelated occurrences impacted either directly or indirectly on the U.S. Marine advisory effort in South Vietnam. The French completed their military withdrawal from South Vietnam and dissolved their high command in April 1956, slightly ahead of schedule. In conjunction with this final phase of the French withdrawal, the Training Relations Instructions Mission was abolished. Thus, it was no longer necessary for the MAG programs to be executed through the Combined Training Mission. Shortly after the departure of the last French troops, Lieutenant Colonel Crozat ended his assignment as Senior Marine Advisor. He was replaced by Lieutenant Colonel William N. Wilkes, Jr. in June 1956. A veteran of the Guadalcanal campaign, Wilkes came to Vietnam from Washington, D.C., where he had recently completed a French language course. Like his predecessor, the new Senior Marine Advisor was scheduled to serve in Vietnam for 2 years. In August, less than 2 months after Lieutenant Colonel Wilkes' arrival, President Diem appointed a new officer to head his Marine Corps. This time, Bui Pho Chi, the captain who had commanded the 1st Landing Battalion during the Sect Uprising, was selected for the assignment. Chi's appointment was only temporary, however, for in October, Diem ordered Major Lanu Hung to assume command of the Marine Corps. Major Hung, who became the VNMC's 4th senior officer, was to hold the position for 4 years. An attempt to abolish the Vietnamese Marine Corps coincided with the series of changes in its leadership and the departure of Lieutenant Colonel Crozat. During the summer months, the Vietnamese Minister of Defense proposed that the VNMC be made a branch of South Vietnam's army. Fortunately, the recent combat record of the 1st Landing Battalion outweighed the minister's influence, and the effort to disestablish the Vietnamese Marine Corps was thwarted. Another noteworthy incident in the record of the early relations between the U.S. and Vietnamese Marines occurred when the Marine non-commissioned officer billet within the MAG was upgraded to an officer position. This adjustment, which anticipated the creation of the 2D Landing Battalion, had the effect of making a U.S. Marine officer available to advise individual VNMC battalions on a permanent basis. Thus originated a plan whereby a U.S. Marine officer would advise each Vietnamese Marine battalion, a concept abandoned only temporarily between 1959 and 1962. The Vietnamese Marine Corps continued as a 2-battalion regiment under the command of Major Lanu Hung from mid-1956 through 1959. During this period, Lieutenant Colonel Wilkes and his successor, Lieutenant Colonel Frank R. Wilkinson, Jr., a Marine who had served as an aide to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, instituted a variety of programs intended to provide the Vietnamese Marines with a common base of experience and training. Perhaps the most important of these was one implemented in 1958, whereby Vietnamese Marine officers began attending basic and intermediate level schools at Marine Corps Schools, Quantico. Other formal schools for non-commissioned officers were established by the Vietnamese Marine Corps in South Vietnam. In an effort to build esprit de corps among the lower-ranking Vietnamese Marines, the U.S. advisors encouraged voluntary enlistments. They also persuaded their Vietnamese counterparts to adopt a corps-wide marksmanship training program similar to the one then in use by the U.S. Marine Corps. In conjunction with the reorganization of the VNMC and the stress being placed upon small unit and individual training, much of the U.S. advisory effort during this period was devoted to logistics. The Marine advisors soon discovered that the Vietnamese officers, who had not been directly concerned with supply matters under the French, tended to ignore this important area. The real problem, explained Captain Breckenridge, was the newness of it all. The Vietnamese officers simply possessed no base of experience or training in logistic matters. This shortcoming dictated that the American advisors not only design a workable logistics system, but closely supervise its operation as well. Wilkes and Wilkinson instituted intensive schooling of supply and maintenance personnel and emphasized the value of command supervision to the Vietnamese leaders. The Marine advisors, for example, taught their counterparts that equipment shortages could often be prevented if command attention were given to requisitions. Still, even with constant supervision and formal schooling, the Vietnamese Marine Corps continued to experience problems in this area throughout the 1950s and well into the next decade. Breckenridge, who returned to serve with the Vietnamese Marines again as a lieutenant colonel in the late 1960s, recalled shortages of such vital and common items as small arms ammunition even then. The years between 1955 and 1959 also saw the Marine advisors working to overcome a potentially more serious problem, one that also dated from the French Indochina War. From the outset of their experience with the Vietnamese Marine Corps, the Marine advisors perceived that a strong defensive orientation seemed to pervade every echelon of the small service. Most Americans, including U.S. Army advisors who were encountering similar difficulties with the Vietnamese Army, agreed that this defensive psychology was a byproduct of the long subordination of the Vietnamese national forces to the French High Command. Indeed, a criticism frequently voiced by U.S. MAG officials during the Indochina War had been that the French tended to frustrate the development of the Vietnamese military forces by assigning them static security tasks rather than offensive missions. Even though the forerunners of the Vietnamese Marine battalions had operated as commando units, they too had seen extensive duty protecting Dynasot bases and other French installations. Now, this defensive thinking was affecting the attitude of the Vietnamese Marine toward training. Moreover, it was threatening the American effort to transform the service into an aggressive amphibious strike force. By nature, this particular problem defied quick, simple solutions. The Marine advisors, therefore, undertook to adjust the orientation of the entire Vietnamese Marine Corps over a prolonged period through continuous emphasis on offensive training. The advisors consistently encouraged their Vietnamese counterparts to develop training schedules which stressed patrolling, ambushing, fire and maneuver, and night movement. In this same connection, the Marine advisors translated U.S. Marines' small unit tactics manuals into French, whereupon the same manuals were further translated by Vietnamese Marines into Vietnamese. This process assured that adequate training literature was made available to the individual Marine and his small unit leaders. The offensively oriented training programs and the translation project complemented one another, and combined with continuous supervision by the U.S. advisors and the return of young Vietnamese officers from Quantico, gradually helped impart a more aggressive offensive spirit to the entire Marine Corps. Summing up developments. The years between 1955 and 1959 constitute perhaps the most critical and challenging span in the chronicle of the Vietnamese Marine Corps. Born out of the confusion which dominated South Vietnam in the aftermath of the Geneva Agreement, the embryonic Marine Corps had survived against heavy odds. Even before its scattered components could be drawn together under a centralized command, the Corps had been hurled into combat against the rebellious sects. Over the course of their commitment, the Vietnamese Marines had strengthened their own cause through demonstrations of their fighting capability and loyalty. In terms of the VNMC's continued existence, equally critical battles were being waged in Saigon, where the senior U.S. Marine advisor and the Vietnamese senior Marine officer struggled to gain support for the infant service. It was there, ironically, that the destiny of the Vietnamese Marine Corps ultimately had been decided. On balance, the interval between 1955 and 1959 was characterized by uncertainty, transition, and problem-solving. Never sure of the Marine Corps' future, the senior Vietnamese Marine officer and a handful of U.S. Marine advisors had carried forward their efforts to transform scattered, French-inspired river commando units into a coherent and responsive American-style amphibious force. While this transformation was only partially realized, definite progress was apparent. Vietnamese officers had replaced French commanders, and with American guidance had given their service a strong interim structure. Many of the more serious problems which had plagued the struggling organization since its inception had been identified. With American assistance, solutions to those problems were being developed and tested. So, despite a stormy beginning and a threatened early childhood, the Vietnamese Marine Corps lived.